Thank you to BQE, the makers of BQE Core, for their support of this episode. BQE Core is the software that makes it easy to manage your projects and people for maximum productivity and ultimate profitability. Learn more at bqe.com. So, give us a quick update on the house hunting adventure, Cormac.
Well, as you could probably assume, we were back in Michigan this past weekend.
We can always assume that you were in Michigan again.
You can always assume that
there was another trip to Michigan.
There was another trip. However, we are currently recording on a weekend right now that I am not actually in Michigan.
You guys are dividing and conquering.
We are dividing and conquering.
Successfully.
My wife is there. Yes. So last weekend we were there. We were looking at a handful of houses, and there was a couple that we couldn't see because they weren't ready, and it was Easter weekend and everything else. And so I had to come home because I had to take my daughter back because her spring break was over with, but it was my wife's spring break was just starting. So we pre-planned and decided that because we were also on the college tour, that we were going to just drive 2 cars, and that she would stay after we were done with all of that stuff, and then head back. It's not a college tour. It's the college that he's going to. We were visiting it. How about that? I guess that's what it's called. College tour means that we're looking at other colleges. Nope. We found the right one. Although, funny side story here. So, he's always been really good at environmental science and has always excelled at all of the different environmental science courses that he took in high school. And so he's sitting there, and we met up with the dean of the School of Environmental Science, and we're going through everything. We're talking to her and stuff. She's talking about the curriculum, and his eyes are glazing over a little bit.
Wow.
And she's talking about like some of the prerequisites that he needs to take. He's got to take, physics. He's got to take calculus. He's got to take, all these different chemistries and stuff. And he's just like, nah. It's like, I think I'm going to go into fisheries and wildlife management, which I will say, and not very many people who are listening know my child, but that sounds more like him anyway. He was always like, we used to, nickname called him, Bug, because he was always like picking up bugs, playing with bugs, saving animals, and all this other stuff. And that honestly has always been his draw to environmental sciences, the environmental sciences, not environmental sciences as a specific job, but just like, that kind of like focus and mindset was always the reason why he did it, was more of kind of like his love of animals. And so then we started to look into the other program, and it's kind of more in the mindset of like his path of what he wants to do anyway. He wants to work outside. He wants to work with animals. I think he's watched Animal Planet way too much. And
is there such a thing? You can't really watch it too much.
Well, I guess not. But there's the episodes that have like the wildlife, management folks of the National Parks Service. And he's like, that's what I want to do.
Interesting. That's cool.
I don't want to go and like,
well, he thinks that's what he wants to do, right? Like that's to me has always been a mismatch of schools wanting you to pick a thing that you're going to do for the rest of your life, and parents wanting their kids to pick a thing that they're going to do for the rest of, or having an idea of what their kids are going to do for the rest of their life. And it's like, that was how I went through it as well. And I don't agree with that anymore. I think it's more like, no, you got to figure out what you're going to do as you figure it out. It's not like make that decision so young that then and the reason I guess I feel like this is, number one, I've got kids that their interests change quite often, right? And
as frequently as the wind changes.
Yeah. They go all in on something and then they go all out of it. Not shortly after that. And so And so there's that part of it. But there's also what I saw in architecture school, which was students in architecture school feeling like they had to stay in architecture school because for any number of reasons, whether it was the investment that they've made, financially, whether it was how difficult it was to get in because of the impacted program that it was, whether it was something that their parents had expectations on them or some other family member had expectations that they were going to do, and they were miserable. And it's like, really, you got to stick with this thing and be miserable because of, one of these other factors? I don't agree with that anymore. And so if that's just something he's interested in and he can kind of figure that out, but switch his major at any time, then fine. It is kind of odd, though, that these schools require people to pick majors. I guess they want to know who's enrolled in what and where they're tracking and all that kind of stuff, but they don't really place limitations on what they can change their mind about at what point, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that there was an expectation. I think he basically checked the box, I'm interested in environmental science.
Is there like an undeclared kind of still checkbox option?
I don't know, but I told him, I'm like, you don't have to choose right now. I mean, take some classes, see if it's something that interests you. If it doesn't, well, guess what? You're a freshman. You can pick something else. You can, there's like, you are not fixed on what your trajectory in life is going to be. And you can try out whatever it is that you want to try out. And if there's nothing that sticks, okay, well, then let's check something else.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a cool place to be for that kind of major. You are literally like in the wilderness.
Yeah. I mean,
northern Michigan, right?
Yeah, up the Upper Peninsula.
Yeah, that's cool.
And so there's a lot that is to be offered for either one of the programs. Whether it's environmental science or wildlife management. So yes, so that is actually one of the draws for this particular school. It's a smaller school, which is great. It actually has. Other than like his general courses, which, may have up to, as they were saying, 25 to 30 students. And I kind of chuckled at that.
Right. That's awesome, man. That's like a studio when we were in school, right? It was like 16 people in the studio. It's a great size.
And more major specific classes would be, between she said 8 to 12, depending on like, what your major is. And what was interesting is, so, my wife and I were talking, and so I'm going to pose this question to you too. She's just like, what was the largest class you ever had? And she was just like, she was telling me, that I think her largest class was like 110. And I was just like, yeah, 250.
Wow.
I know because the max capacity of the room of the physics, of physics, and it was physics of all things. Physics,
the lecture class
was 250. Yeah, the lecture class for physics was 250.
Because then there's a bunch of labs, and they probably broke it down into like 30 students or 24 or something.
Yeah. Right. Which was interesting because like, so when I got out of the Army, I had started at Troy State University, which is now just Troy University, and it was a smaller school. So a lot of like my early, like gen ed classes and stuff like that they were bigger classes, but they were still smaller because it was a smaller school. And then the only one that I was the only like gen ed that I was unable to finish before I got to, and I guess it wasn't gen ed. It was gen ed specific to my degree path, was physics. And so when I got to Auburn, I had to take calculus and then physics with calculus. And you would think that you'd think that with those classes that it would be smaller. No, it was 250. It was just like, geez,
that's huge. I never had a class that big. The biggest class I probably have had was like music appreciation or architectural history, but it wasn't the lecture. And I'm just thinking like, what was the size of the lecture hall? But I've designed a science building with huge lecture rooms, like probably 200 capacity was the large lecture room. And then it really is the only reason I kind of know about all that, what I was just saying about how they break it down, is because there were 3 levels to this building. The different levels had the different types of science labs. There was organic and inorganic, and there was the biology labs, and there was the physics labs, and all of these. And what's interesting there is that the different programs have different capacities in the room based on, I don't know what it's based on actually. If it's based on the ratio that they want to achieve, that's probably what it is. But it was like the biology labs had 24 kids. The chemistry labs were 30. The physics labs were 32. It was something like that. The breakdown was different for each discipline. And I thought that was interesting because then there's no, like the labs didn't line up floor to floor because of that, right? Like the bays are different, and it made things difficult to lay out the structure for the building because the floor plates didn't line up, from lab sizes. It was all about lab sizes. So they had like the same depth, but the labs would get wider or narrower depending on the capacity.
Yeah. I think the last 4 buildings that I've done recently was basically a physics lab building with laser labs, mass spectrometer labs, and things like that in it. So it was all an instrument-based lab building. And unfortunately for me, it was all fixed floor-to-floor, fixed structure because it was a
retrofit,
major renovation. Yeah. Which was a waffle slab with a 11-foot-8 floor-to-floor heights.
Wow.
Which,
brutal.
Then we
because they're so mechanically equipment driven, right?
Exactly. In the more recent one that I did for Hopkins, they, it was a medical research lab, and because it was a retrofit and addition, and the retrofit was was kind of integrated because it was the old children's medical center wing of the hospital. It matched up with the adjacent, more historical buildings in the Hopkins medical campus, or the hospital campus. There's 2 different things, medical and hospital.
Those words sound the same, but they are 2 different things.
And so 12-foot-8 floor-to-floor heights was what I had to match.
Which one did you do first? 11-8 or 12-8? Oh, you're saying the one is right next to the other.
No. 11-8 was my first lab building that I did with ASG.
Oh, so if you could do 11-8, you could easily do 12-8.
If I could do 11-8, I could easily do 12-8. Even though there was far more fume hoods and glove cabinets, all of the trimmings for a medical research lab, as well as a vivarium and everything else. And so there was no way that we were able to make the mechanical work the way that we did. So we saddlebagged the building, and all of the ductwork was up top. And we basically created this big, massive chase down the side and just plugged it in, had the main trunks run vertically and had the secondary trunks running, horizontally at each of the floors.
Those have to be some big ass fans on the roof.
Oh, big ass. Yeah. Some big ass fans. And then
not the brand.
And then,
this is not a sponsored episode by big ass fans.
Exactly. And so the strobic fans on top, it's interesting is that when somebody's going through Hopkins Medical School, they have this thing called the coding ceremony. And, that's when you get your doctor's coat and all that other stuff. And you go in front of the historic dome. It's the first building on campus. It's like the main iconic thing. It's actually part of their logo. And our building is literally like, if I would say inches behind it, is how close it feels. But it towers over the top of it because it was 12 stories occupiable. Then we added basically 3 stories of mechanical on top of it. And then, in front of it, we made another addition that kind of matched up with the floor to floor. So it's this big, massive hulking building behind it. And the whole time, and we were, I'm going to, take another diversion. Yesterday, for the first time in a long time, which just felt good to get out of the house and actually go to a job site. We were reviewing some mock-up panels for, the metal panels that we have on there. this, really interesting textured dimpled stainless steel pattern for, kind of like these doors, and, our loading dock doors that are actually on the front of the building. So we're trying to like make them all disappear and everything, as well as just kind of integrating it into kind of like this whole language that we've got going on. So we were looking at...
They can disappear until the trucks show up, Cormac.
Well, and they were okay with that, but they wanted it to disappear when the trucks weren't there. What was interesting is, so the contractors, both the actual like construction manager, as well as one of the primes for all of our windows and all of our metal panels, we were at their yard, at the windows and metal panel guy's yard, and we were talking through everything. And just as I was asking questions, playing devil's advocate to the other two architects that were with me, about like, how the client's going to, view this, how the donors are going to view this, how everybody else is going to view this. It was interesting because I was paying attention to the looks on the faces of the contractors and stuff. And I kind of stopped and paused and I was like, I know that a lot of this conversation seems kind of like, probably trivial to you guys, but this is the kind of things that like we can't sign off on this for you to move forward with until we get this whole like cast of characters to sign off on it as well. And so me playing devil's advocate of like talking about, is this, like sharp edges? Is this, like maintenance, abilities and all of these things, durability, like, is it going to oil can? And like, I just started shooting off all these different, like, what ifs. And they're just like, no, it's actually kind of great to like see into the reason why you guys make all of these decisions. It's just like, we just see, you've chosen this one. And then we, fabricate it. We do our shop drawings, everything else. Then we fabricate it, then we install it, and then we walk away. And it's just like, I was just like, no, I was like, funny. It was like, it takes years to get to even your process, to your point in the project. It has taken us years to get to that one.
And then that feedback loop needs to get back into the design process, right? Of
right. Exactly.
What was that installation and ultimately use like that then informs the next version? Because every building's a prototype, like every single one.
We were really interested in like why you picked this particular material, but listening to you guys talk through it, it's kind of apparent the rationale that you're using for this. They were like, at first, we would have just said, hey, why don't you just do a composite, aluminum metal panel that, goes over, these doors and everything else. And, that's just kind of like either painted or kind of like a brush finish. And, we started talking about like, okay, well, this is at grade level, people are walking by, this is an urban site, sidewalk is literally right up against these doors. And so maintenance is going to be huge. People are going to be running their hands across it. There's going to be, they attempted some graffiti, people are going to try to scratch this stuff and everything else. And so, and we even noticed some scratches on just the, mock-up panels. But, you take like 2 steps back from like being right on it and the scratches disappear. And we were, trying to explain to them, this is why we chose the material that we did, is because this is durable. It is maintainable. It does hide dirt and things like that pretty well. And so they just like, having that conversation kind of almost gives even the installers the insight in. It's just like, okay, well, next time we talk about, things, because we also had them as part of a design assist early on. And, they came up with like all sorts of like, value engineering options for that metal panel. And we kept pushing back. And they're just like, you could have saved a lot of money on these panels. Like we could have, however, and they're like, oh, now I see why you pushed back. And it's just like, and so it's like having a good conversation about the process, was really it was kind of nice. And so anyway, just to kind of like get out and, have that conversation with them was, it was good to kind of like have that conversation. It was a conversation that we rarely ever have. And we rarely ever have in the process of doing like the making of some of these things with the people who are not only going to be occupying it, but the people who are going to be building it, and then the people who are going to be seeing it. I mean, I even we set up a camera and we were taking pictures from like every angle, and we were just like, and they're just like, okay, well, what like oblique views do you want to see? And so like we were looking at it straight on, and it was just like, okay, well, think about this. Like, if you're coming up to these doors, where are you coming from? And they're just like, people are like looking at me like, well, what the hell does that mean? Or what does that matter? And I'm like, well, think about this. There's the parking, we were in a parking lot, but I'm talking through the process of like where these are on the actual site. I'm like, and I point to my left, I'm like, right over there is the main parking garage where all of the employees are going to be parking. They're going to be crossing the street over there. They're going to be walking down in front of the doors in this direction here. So why not look at and show everybody the view that at least 90% of the people who are going to be like walking past these doors, the view that they're going to actually have in those doors, with those doors. And they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. It's just like, yeah, it does. I mean, how are people going to engage this building? How are they going to experience it's a weird decision that, to use this particular material. I mean, it's like a heavy gauge stainless steel. It's dimpled. So it makes it, so like when you're looking at it and you're looking at it from different, views and all this other stuff, it actually kind of changes color and it changes texture, but it also like it picks up dirt and it doesn't show it very well. Like if people touch it, you can step back and you don't really see like the fingerprints and all of that other stuff on there. There's going to be road grime and street grime and stuff like that on there and everything else. And how is that going to just react to all of that? People are like, there are way too many decisions for just a piece of metal than we thought it was going to be.
Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. Systems and standard operating procedures. You already know that's how to build a profitable business and find the freedom you want. You need systems and procedures. But you struggle with choosing the systems you need most and how to implement those systems quickly so you can get back to doing what you love most. The Designing Your Business Masterclass series was created by an acclaimed architect and business consultant, Douglas Teager, FAIA, to help fellow architects and engineers run their firms more profitably while maintaining a healthy work-life balance. Douglas grew from a solo practitioner to become managing partner of his 30-plus person firm, and then later sold his firm so he can do what he does today, helping architects be more successful at Teager Consulting. On the third Wednesday of every month, Douglas dives deep into an essential topic that will strengthen the profitability of your firm and make it sustainable for growth in the years to come. Register now for the Designing Your Business Masterclass with Douglas Teager at bqe.com/masterclass and start implementing powerful systems for the profitability you need and the freedom you want. Every live masterclass session includes AIA continuing education credit, and when you visit bqe.com/masterclass, you'll have access to the full library of past sessions on demand. The Designing Your Business Masterclass is free, and it's brought to you by our friends at BQE, the makers of BQE Core, the software that makes it easy to manage your projects and people for maximum productivity and ultimate profitability. Register now for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass at bqe.com/masterclass. That's bqe.com/masterclass. And now let's get back to our conversation. Why do you have the luxury of including everybody so early in the project? I mean, this is obviously a loaded question when it gets into delivery models and all those things and what's wrong with a lot of accepted delivery models that are out there. But why is it different this time?
Because there's so many people that have opinions and eyes and the ability to shut things down early. Because I was trying to explain to him, it's just like you have the School of Medicine who has their opinions. You have Hopkins Hospital, who is the actual, that's where the building actually is on the hospital campus, and it's being built by the hospital, and it'll be leased to the School of Medicine. So, you've got their opinions. Then you've got the School of Medicine's board of directors. Then you have the hospital's board of directors. Then you have the donors. And then you have, like you have all of these different people who have opinions about like the material and everything else. And if one of them has has a no objection to it, or a no and objection, not a no objection, but has an objection on the material.
Yeah, there you go.
Then it's like back to square one. And so having it mocked up, having people like really take a look at it and understand, all of the intricacies of just that, the decisions that go behind it, and what are all of the engagements of like the physical engagements of it, not just like the monetary engagements, but like the physical engagements of it, and like really letting people understand what it is that they're getting. If you don't get that buy-in, here we are, we literally have got a big hole in the ground. We've got a tower crane up, they're pouring foundations and everything else, or at least prepping the site for foundations and everything else, that if we're at square one on the cladding material, which of course, because of the environment right now that we're in, is got an enormously long lead time, that if we're not like right now getting buy off on it, that later on when they actually go and buy it, or if somebody says no and we have to start from square one again, that lead time just keeps pushing further and further out. That then you're talking about escalation of cost, escalation of schedule, so on and so on and so on. So, it's just, so to have the luxury, and I would say that this is I'd say probably about a 3-year process just to get to where we were yesterday, standing in front of that mock-up. It was 3 years of us going through a variety of different materials to get to just that point of standing right in front of them. Now, though they've given us the approval for that, it doesn't mean that it's the final approval until, we get everybody to, like, all of those different people who have their hands in the decision-making pots. Once we get everybody to kind of like check off on it, then we can breathe a sigh of relief that, gives them the ability to move forward with all of this. Because then there's the, shop drawing process, then there's the fabrication process, then there's the installation process, and all of this other stuff. And, so there's a lot of stuff that goes into just that. And that right there alone is probably about a 1.5 year process.
Which is a huge unseen thing usually from the contractor side of things, right? Which is they tend to look at things through a lens of right here, right now, as I'm building this. And like you said a minute ago, then they walk away. And so for them to be exposed to this process of the value that, or let's not even call it the value, let's just call it your job as an architect, to decide these things with everybody's consensus, right? The buy-in of everybody that you outlined, which is like multi-headed client to the nth degree.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Right?
This is a total hydra.
And so when you think about it from that perspective, I think that is illuminating to a contractor to see, like you said, wow, like we never thought about it in all of these different ways, which require the sign off of all of these different groups of people. And you gave a long answer to a loaded question, which was, why is it like this? Because I think this is kind of the preferred way to do it, which is to get a lot of people involved early, including the builder. And it doesn't sound like this is design build.
It wasn't design build. It was the construction manager has been on the project since day one.
So, okay. Yeah. So they're advising early.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there has been some design assist, that some of those design assist partners that we had early on then became the contractors for those particular things. And some of them didn't. Thankfully, the one who helped us work through a lot of our window detailing and our metal panel detailing and things like that are the ones who, ended up being the exactly.
That's cool, man. I mean,
and they understand that exactly, kind of a lot of the rationale. But then I was also, one of the interesting things was that as I was sitting there and I was explaining to the contractors, both the prime doing the work and the construction manager, I'm like, But you also have to understand this, that the questions that I'm asking my fellow architects are the same questions they're going to ask you. Why did you do this? Why did you? And so they're going to start pointing fingers. If they don't like something, that might be a decision that's like on us, the architect. They're also going to, point fingers at the contractor and say, why did you do this? Why, and so I was posing some pretty tough questions to them too. And I'm just like, I'm going to challenge you guys on why we're doing what we're doing. And the thing about it is that when you get challenged on why we're doing what we're doing, you have to have a firm, very convicted response to why we're doing it. And let them understand, like all of the thinking that took place beforehand to get to that one thing wasn't just, oh, we're going to pick that material. That's the only material we're going to do. We have tested. We have gone through the process of testing and reviewing and putting in front of the client so many different metal panels that you just can't even imagine how many different, mock-ups we've done above and beyond the call of duty, for sure. But it was the right thing to do to make sure that, this building, which is, a couple $100 million worth of a building, is like all of the choices are the right choice. And so I was just like, look, you're going to be taught, you're going to be brought to task as much as we're going to be brought to task. And so we, as the design and construction, team, needs to be prepared for when they do come back and ask those questions, and be prepared to defend our rationale and reasons behind it. Yes, we've got all of the meeting minutes from all of the different times where they've looked at, reviewed, and approved all of those. But sometimes what does that matter when you're standing in front of it and you're like, oh, that's what we were going to get? Why? So,
well, the short answer of my original question is because this is a private project is why you have these luxuries. And I kind of, I think it's important to expose that up front to, especially to students who are thinking about the types of, firms they want to go work for. If you want to learn a lot, you want to work on design build projects because you're going to get these feedback loops that we're talking about. You're going to have the multi-headed clients if you're talking about university projects or healthcare projects or lean construction projects, as far as like delivery models, design build. But having those people identified who's going to build the project, at least who's going to be responsible for the delivery of the built part of the project. Maybe you don't have all of the subs involved the whole time as much as you would during design build, right? Where you're doing a guaranteed maximum price or something, and you kind of get all of the subs to sign on the line during that initial phase. But still, you get the feedback loop and you learn, because it's like, be honest about it. Architects don't have the opportunity to be on site during construction as much as we should be.
Or as even much as we want to be.
As much as you want to be, as much as you should be, because that getting that information that happens during the build part of the process back into the design process cannot be understated. Like, it's huge. And so the types of projects that, like you're talking about here, Cormac, is important to state what kind it is, because design bid build doesn't work like this at all. And it's screwed up in that sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the course of like the last 7 years of my career has been with a firm that does these type of, projects with this type of delivery method. And we do have the luxury of having like design assist partners and things like that. That it's not necessarily a design build type process, but it's pretty close.
And it's also not as adversarial, I think. Like, that's also a thing to bring up, because there is buy-in from the whole gamut through the whole process. Whereas like design bid build often leads to adversarial conditions during the construction.
Oh my gosh, totally. So
often meaning like 99%.
Whereas you and I, have had quite a bit of our career in doing things like, K through 12. And K through 12 is definitely, design bid build, and it's definitely low bid, wins. And it definitely does lead to a very adversarial thing, because whereas they're not necessarily looking at like all of your documentation. And I don't want to not be fair to the contractors and stuff, but my experience has been is that, they're looking at, like, okay, I could, here's where I could save money. Here's where I could save money. Here's where I could save money kind of, approach to things. And so they're looking at ways of, making the budget a little bit more friendly to the client and stuff. And then when we get out there and we see things that are being built opposite of like what we drew, or a different material or a different, manufacturer or things like that than, what was even agreed upon with our shop drawings, things tend to turn very adversarial. And I've gotten into so many arguments on site where, I just had to like, take the deep breath, be the professional and just kind of like walk away and say, it's not that you're winning this fight. It's just, I can't keep doing this right now and, stay professional.
Yeah. And what's interesting, you want to give the contractors the benefit of the doubt and say they did look at everything and do all their due diligence during the bidding and ask the right questions then. But then those RFIs and those change orders start coming in. And did you know, Cormac, a friend of the show, Charisse Lakeside, told me about this. There's a book that you can get called Contractor's Guide to Change Orders. Mm. And it's to school contractors on how to get paid as much as possible during the construction process, and look in the drawings in certain places for certain things, and if those aren't there, to take advantage of it.
Well, that just supports my long time assumption that when contractors are bidding on a project, they basically get two sets of documents, two sets of documents. They give one to kind of like your general bidding. Then they give one to the, change orders group. And they basically sit there and say, okay, here's how we can bid this. I was like, oh, and here's how. There's just enough vague information. We had this one where we had what we felt was everything legitimately covered in our general notes. And so they're like, well, you don't have a detail in there. I was like, we don't have a detail, but we do have the general note in there that covers that all of these ceilings are going to be at X, oh, well, we don't look at the general notes. We never
Well, that is the contract document.
Like, yes, exactly. I was like, well, guess what though? I don't want to turn this into a conversation about that, but
well, getting back to the thing about this being a private job and not having to deal with public bid and low bid, right? Therefore, public bid means low bid. You're going to go with the lowest qualified bidder. And so it doesn't necessarily guarantee the lowest bidder is going to get the job, but the lowest qualified bidder is going to get the job, right? And that's going to create these types of circumstances that you get to avoid when you're doing a public project, or at least avoid a lot more. And I can definitely say that working at the university level, the community college level, even the science building that I was talking about earlier, working with that contractor who wants to deliver a quality project to a quality client because it's a campus that is going to build more things is night and day different than the public bid and delivery, design, bid, build process.
Yep, totally. And, like say you've got a K through 12 client who's they're beholden to so many different public funding entities. And so they've got to justify, well, you went with the second bid instead of the low bid. Why? And so they've got those challenges that they've got to deal with. Whereas at the private institutions, they can say, oh, well, you went with the second bid instead of the low bid. Why? It's easily more, justifiable in that particular case because, they're looking for the quality. They're looking for this. Things like this particular project at Hopkins, they're trying to build world-class medical research facilities to pull in, attract researchers, attract those, principal investigators. And, with attracting those PIs, they're also attracting grant dollars. They're also attracting, press and everything else. They're attracting things. And so you can't just say, well, we're going to go with like the low bid and just hope for the best. They're still going to do, some quality control. And it's not to say that the low bid in certain cases isn't going to be a good quality one, but a lot of times people low bid so much to get the project to then go back to what Charisse was saying is look for all of those change orders, that they're savvy enough because they've done it so much. They're savvy enough to recognize that if you go for the low bid and it's such a sea of difference between that and like say the cluster of like the middle bids, which is always seems to be the case. You usually have like a big cluster, like say 5-6 contractors that they're all like within a percentage of each other. And then you've got one that's like 10% lower. And then you've got one that's like 10% higher. And, the freedom of a private project is they get to toss both of those out and then really look at the ones that you can tell they all really truly looked at the project because they're coming up with numbers that are really close to each other. And then they're just talking about like little things that set them apart from each other. Or they look at things like, and which is really interesting, is this was something that I never had the experience of being able to do in public funded projects, is in these privately funded projects, is they will basically give, the bidders list to the architect as well. And, they'll say, okay, we've looked at this one, this one, this one, this one. These are the,
what's your experience working with all these?
Exactly. And they'll, and they'll involve us with the conversation. And I was just like, wow, I've never felt this before. It's interesting.
This is a new feeling.
Power. Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
But so back to your original question. Offer was accepted.
Okay.
Finally.
I'm glad you've looped this back.
And we just had a home inspection.
Nice.
And
congrats. Hopefully. This is like I said, you don't, it's the kind of thing you kind of announce quietly.
I announced quietly, only just that's where we are in the process. It was interesting that like through the start of this adventure of looking at houses, especially in this particular market, and especially with the way that the volatile mortgage interest rates are climbing, that you had actually said it the best was, don't get married to something until you have keys in hand. And it totally changed my perspective of just like park all hope at the front door.
There you go.
I was telling other people, I was just like, yeah, we finally got an offer accepted. And they were just like, congratulations. I'm like, whoa, simmer down. And they're just like, don't you have any hope? I'm like, I keep forgetting that I'm a Lions fan. And
I think I know what you mean by that. Even.
If you have,
like being a Jets fan, right?
Yeah. If you have low or no expectations, that any positive outcome is just great. But like,
pleasantly surprised.
Damned if I hadn't forgotten, who I am and what my beliefs are, that I have, like I should just, keep reminding myself that you have low expectations in life. I know that sounds horrible.
Well, hoping for the best, man.
Yeah, hoping for the best. But I think you can tell just by the way that when everybody, says, oh, congratulations. I'm like, simmer down, simmer down.
We'll wait and see.
There are so many hurdles that I have to get through before I do this. And now I'm learning, now that we've got our home inspection back, I'm looking at things. And now that I'm learning really what the expectations for the VA loan process is, especially in the way that, they look at the inspection process. I'm cautiously optimistic, but also very cautious because there are some things that they flagged that, are no big deal in the end of it all. But you look at it and you're just like, well, here we are at the beginning. Is this going to be red flags for the VA home inspection process? Because they literally want a perfect move-in ready home for veterans. They don't want them to have to move in, and they don't fund fixer-uppers.
They've got a quality threshold.
So they have a quality threshold. And so, this is a 1941 house. And so though it's been well maintained and well taken care of, there's just some things that show sign of age, and we'll just see where it's at. And so that's where I'm putting my expectations are. It's like, we will see. It's just, everybody's like, oh, it's so exciting. I'm like, I have no excitement. It's just like, I can't get excited until, there are so many hurdles that I got to get over right now. And I don't let's try not to trip on the first one. Then we'll get to the next one, and then try to get over that one. Then get to the next one, get over that one. Like baby steps here.
This reminds me of the we'll see parable. You heard of the we'll see story?
Oh,
you probably have.
No,
so I'll just read it. I just pulled it up here. It's once upon a time there was an old farmer who had worked his crops for many years, and one day his horse ran away. And upon hearing the news, his neighbors came to visit and said, "Such bad luck," they said sympathetically. "You must be so sad." "We'll see," the farmer replied. The next morning, the farmer returned, the next morning, the horse returned, bringing it 2 other wild horses. "How wonderful," the neighbors exclaimed. "Not only did your horse return, but you received 2 more. What great fortune you have." "We'll see," answered the farmer. The following day, his son tried to take one of the untamed horses, was thrown, and broke his leg. The neighbors once again came to offer their sympathy on his misfortune. "Now your son cannot help you with the farming," they said. "What terrible luck you have." "We'll see," replied the old farmer. "This is almost over. Bear with me." Following week, military officials came to the village to conscript young men into the army. Seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by, and the neighbors congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out. "Such great news! You must be so happy." The man smiled to himself and said once again, "We'll see." That's what this house hunting is like. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, honestly, the funniest thing is that with my wife being in Michigan and me here, and we're basically been kind of like either FaceTiming or just chatting back and forth. And she's just like, just reading a text from her, and her like stomach is in knots right now.
Oh,
she's like, I don't know. She's like, I
Did
don't
you
know.
Tell
how
her
I'm
not
sleep.
to get married.
Yeah. Well, I just told her, every time she would say, "Well, what about this?" I'm like, "We'll see." And she's like, "Well, what about that?" "Well, we'll see when we see." And so literally that I have been living that parable for the past week now.
It does seem like the kind of thing that, it's all you can do. There's so many things out of your control that it makes no sense to worry about those things that are completely out of your control, because all you can do is invent possible futures and worry about them.
Right.
So that's putting yourself through a tremendous amount of stress.
And so she's done that, and she's been kind of stressing out about that. And whereas I was so I didn't set a, this New Year's goal or anything like that. The only thing that I set was a perspective change. And the perspective change is you can only do what you can do. And so that literally is how I've been approaching, not only the project and everything else, but it, was also the approach to, this house buying and house hunting and everything else is like, you can only do what you can do. If they take the offer, great. If they don't take the offer, well, it's on to the next one. There's just our part that we can play in it. There are other people who, have all of these other parts to play in it, but we can only do what we can do. And if it works out, awesome. If it doesn't, on to the next one.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear the next update in the next recording. Thank you to BQE, the makers of BQE Core, for their support of this podcast episode. Visit bqe.com/masterclass to register for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass. Thanks for listening. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. See all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what we're doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and don't forget to share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at archispeakpodcast.com, where you can find our entire catalog of shows. Talk to you soon.